Welcome to part 2 of microservices in NestJS. In part 1 we talked about microservices, but only at a conceptual level. In this video we're going to dive into the code and actually build our first microservice. But before we do that, let's take a quick look at one more slide and talk about what we're going to build before we switch over to VS Code. I'm going to do things a little different for this video. Instead of starting from scratch, we're going to start with an example of a traditional app. It'll be super simple. Just a controller with a single method that injects a service that also has just a single method. For this example, our service will be a math service that simply sums the elements of an array and returns that result. We will review the code for this example, and then we're going to recreate this example as a microservice using basic TCP as the transport. This will involve creating two Nest projects, one for the web app and the other for the microservice. Simple enough, right? I promise you it is. Let's jump into the code and I'll show you what to do now. This is our starting point. If you look here in the source folder of this traditional app, we just have 4 files. The entry point is main.ts, where the app is bootstrapped. When it's bootstrapped, the app module is passed to it, and the app module contains references to the controller and service. So let's review these files individually in that order. Here's our bootstrap. This is basically the bootstrap I believe that you get when you start a new Nest project. I don't believe I've made any changes here. So you define a bootstrap function and then you immediately call that. And in this bootstrap function we are instantiating a Nest app and we're passing it the app module. And then we're, as in any standard web server config here, we're just calling app.listen and passing the port we'd like for it to listen to. So next stop is the app module. We have module here. This is where we define our imports, controllers, providers, standard Nest stuff I hope you're familiar with. In this case we have one controller and one service that we plan to inject in that controller, therefore we put it in our providers. So let's take a look at the controller. Pretty standard. We just annotate it with a controller. I'm instantiating a logger so I can log some messages. In the constructor, I'm doing constructor injection and injecting that math service. We have one method which is mapped to the add route, and the method that's called on this add route is down here, and all we're simply doing is there's going to be passed an array of numbers in the data field. So I'm going to log the numbers that we're adding, and then we're going to call the math service, the accumulate method on the math service, and pass it this array of numbers. So last stop, if we look at the math service, we have an injectable class that's a service. Here we're taking this number and then we're just saying, hey, if it's null, let's just make this an array so that no type errors when we call reduce, and add up those numbers in the array, pass it back. Based on this, if we look back at our controller, if we make a post request to the add route, and pass it an array of a few numbers, then it should add those numbers and return it back. To check this, we're going to go into Insomnia. This is very much like Postman, and you can use Postman if you'd like. However, Insomnia natively supports GraphQL queries, so I like to use it a lot instead. In our local host, port 3000, as we set up in main.ts, I'm just going to pick a post to this add route. And here, I'm going to make a form URL encoded post request, and I'm going to use this format in order to pass an array. So passing 5, 3, and 4 should give us 8, 12. We should get the number 12 back when we send this. Let's give it a shot. And it couldn't connect to server. Perhaps I should start the server. Okay, we're good to go. Let's try this once more. And sure enough, we got 12. And since we added some logging in the controller right here, we can see that, yes, it says adding 5, 3, and 4, and it returned 12. So that is our starting point. From here, let's move on to actually recreating this exact same thing, but in a microservices architecture where we pull out the math service and have two projects. One project for the web app and one project for the microservice that this web app uses. We just reviewed the code for our example traditional app you see at the top here. Because so few changes are required to convert this to a microservices app, I think the best approach is to simply make a copy of this project and modify it to our needs in order to convert it into a microservice. I'm going to actually be making the copy twice, one for the client project and one for the microservice project. So for the client project, what we'll be doing is simply removing that math service because it's going to be extracted and adding in the client code to contact the microservice. In the microservice itself, we'll be setting up the necessary changes in the controller and in the main TS file to be serving data as a microservice rather than a standard HTTP. So let's get started there. Let's make those copies and make those necessary changes. The first thing we want to do is to add NestJS Microservices. Yep, that was very quick. So with that added, we're going to have to make a few changes here, not much. The app module will stay the same, the math service will stay the same. We just need to make some small modifications in the controller and change the bootstrap code in our main TS. So let's start with the controller. First thing I want to do is import message pattern from NestJS Microservices. There we go. And this post, instead of like with an HTTP service, using the post decorator, we're going to use this message pattern decorator. It's going to look pretty much the same. We're going to just call it add. If you look in the NestJS docs, they actually pass an object here. It looks something like command add or something like that. But I mean, it can be whatever you want. To keep it simple, I'm just going to leave it as add, just like it was in our post. I'm going to remove this body information that's specific to HTTP. And let me take a quick look at this. Yeah, I think that's all we really had to do, right? And so here I'll just say define the message pattern for this method. And what will happen is when this is called, the microservice is called with this message pattern, this is how it routes to the controller, right? It takes that message pattern, and we're defining here with this decorator that whenever you receive this message pattern, this is the method that you should execute. Next, we're going to go to our main TS file. In here, we're also going to have to do a few imports. Actually, we're going to have to change this up a bit. So why don't we just start by deleting this code? Here we go. I want to see. Let's make a logger. Logger. And I'll show you what I'm going to do with that in just a moment. So let's actually annotate this. Need a logger instance. And then down in here in the bootstrap, what we're going to do is we're going to do similar to what we did before. We're going to instantiate the with Nest Factory. The only difference is we're going to use the create microservice instead of create. We're going to pass the app module, and we're also going to pass it a microservices options object that we'll define here in just a moment. So just ignore that error for not having that yet. Now with HTTP you do something like app listen, but we're not going to do that and define the port there because the port's going to be defined in that microservices options. So really all we have to do here is tell it to listen, and then instead of giving a port number, we're going to give a callback of who we want to execute some code. In this case, I'm going to just say logger.log. Microservice is listening. So we can see that in the log file and know that that's working. So at this point, we just need to create that that options object, right? Create the microservice options. Well, if I could type today. Says options equals. And then first thing, most important, what the transport is. So let's say transport, import from microservices .tcp. And then the options will be the host and port that we're listening to. So we can say host 127.0.0.1, and the port will be, let's just say 8877. Goodness. There, you happy now? Okay. Not much of a change. We just created a logger. We created an options object, and all we did really here is change this from create to create microservice. And then here, instead of passing a port number and listen, we're actually passing a callback. So if I go to my terminal and I say yarn start dev, okay, here we went. I had to restart it. I don't know why it didn't show in the first round. Maybe I forgot to save. So here we can see microservices listening, microservices listening. So at this point, our server is set up. That's all it took, guys. All we had to do is make one little minor change in a decorator in the controller, and come into the main TS. And instead of doing Nest Factory create, we do Nest Factory create microservice, and we have this little options object because we're passing a bit more information than just a port number, as we often do with an HTTP service. Okay, so we have our microservice listening. Now we need a client that connects to it. So now we're going to swap over, start from the beginning again with that app, but we're going to rip out the microservice and inject a client instead that's going to connect to this microservice and use it instead of that internal code. So now that we have duplicated this into another project and then modified it to be a microservice, we're going to do the same thing again. I'm going to duplicate this, and then this time we're going to modify it to be a client. So here we are back at the starting point, but this time, instead of modifying it to be a microservice, we're going to leave it in a standard HTTP service configuration, remove that math service from the source code, and configure a microservices client that we can inject in place of that math service. It sounds a bit more confusing than it actually is. Hopefully, to keep things clear, before we get into the whole providing and injecting, we're going to focus exclusively on configuring the client. To do that, I'll comment out this bootstrap code. I'll try to. Here we go. And we're going to input some code here to configure that client and have it contact our microservice. Let's start with some import statements. So I'm going to import from NestJS Microservices. If you haven't added it for this project yet, make sure you drop to the terminal and do yarn add NestJS Microservices. From here, we want to import the client proxy factory and transport. Yep. We also want to import a logger from NestJS Common. Good. Let's create a logger. The Nest Microservices option object is going to be the exact same object that we use for the server, so I can actually just paste this in. All right. And then we're going to say constant client, and here's where the magic comes in, equals client proxy factory dot send. Actually, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. delete microservices options. And it's giving me an error because, well, it is the correct, well, perhaps if I just do this, client options. Yeah, okay, so that fixes that. Now, let's make the magic happen. Client dot send, and then we're going to pass in, for this, it'll be number and number array. Add, and then what's some numbers to add? About 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to subscribe to this. Subscribe. I'm going to say whatever the result is, I want you to log that result. Add some spaces so the linter will be happy. Looks like we're pretty good. So if you're wondering what some of this is, maybe it helps if I just kind of put in a comment here. Return type, param type, pattern, and param, right? So when we do the client and we call the send method, the first in this type is that we're going to put in is going to be the return type, and then the second one is the param type. So as you can see here, we're passing an array of numbers, therefore this should be an array of numbers. We're expecting back a single number, just a scalar value, so this is not going to be an array, it's just going to be the number. We subscribe to the result just like what you would do with any observable. So when we boot this up, we should see the sums of these logged to the console. Let's give that a shot. I wonder if I actually left the other one running. I guess we'll find out soon enough, won't we? Connection refused. So I'm going to say that I probably forgot to actually boot that other server up. So let me go do that now. So now that I've got it booted up, let's try again. And we get 6. Right, they're logged. So I can actually change this, and since NodeMon's going to restart it when it detects changes, if I were to add 5 to that, let's save again, we should get 11. See? So everything's working with the client now. At this point, all we have to do is, we don't want to use this in main, right? We want to use this in our controllers. So we're going to make it so that this can be provided and injected in the controller. That's the next step. If we wanted to, and if we were following the Nest documentation, we could go through the trouble to make a provided service specifically for this client proxy so that we could inject it into our controller. However, we're already injecting this math service that we were going to delete, and I think it makes more sense that we use that service layer for what it's meant for, and that is to provide an interface to our controllers, but leave the implementation elsewhere. So we can leave this in place. Instead of deleting this math service, what we're going to do is we're just going to change the implementation. The function signature will remain the same, but instead of actually doing this calculation ourselves, we're going to instantiate a client and use that to reach out. That way no controller changes are required at all to migrate this implementation of the math service. So let's first clean up our main TS file. So we're going to kind of return it to what it looked like before. Let's take all of this, and actually I'm just going to take this out and we're going to paste it into the other file because there'll be some pasting being performed here. Okay, so first off, let's take this line, put it up here. We'll be needing these things. Actually, we won't be needing all of them. I think here we'll need a client proxy instead. Yeah, and then I can make a variable. And then Let's have a constructor so we can instantiate that. Start client equals client proxy factory dot create. I'm kind of retyping some things I don't need to down here. Perhaps I should just do this. Okay, and then instead of doing this, what we're actually going to return is this little spiel we did right here. Return this dot client. Here we're going to have to change that. And yeah, I think that's all we need to do, guys. Let's remove this. Make a new line in the file. I really hate when it formats it like that. I don't know why. Yeah, so we're just, this math service is already injectable. All we did was change the implementation of this accumulate method to use the client proxy, and we don't have to worry about injecting this or providing it anywhere because it's going to be included under the hood with the math service that's already configured. So at this point, I think we're ready to give this a test drive. So I've got this laid out side by side. On the left side is the microservice that we created. On the right side, this is the HTTP app we created that uses that microservice. And down here, I have my Insomnia window, which is like Postman, which I'm going to use to make a post request to the HTTP server, which will contact the microservice to fulfill that request and then return it back. So let's see if everything's working as expected. First, I'll do my start my server up for the microservice. It's listening. So now let's do the same here. Start up the HTTP server. Looks like we're ready to go there as well. So moment of truth, let's just add numbers together. 5, 4, and I don't know, another 4. Let's try that. Click send. Sure enough, we get 13 back. We can see that it hit here on our HTTP server, and we can also see that the HTTP server, to fulfill that request, reached out to the microservice. So we've got something working, guys. We've accomplished something at this point. If you've been following along, that's great. Actually coding along. If you haven't been coding along and you want to kind of just jump to the code, look in the comment section. I will have the links to the repositories with tags on start and finish for all of these files. That's about it for this video. Let's review where we're at in the series next. We have just finished the video on microservices using TCP, so that means that Redis is up next. We're going to use a message broker. I think the next video is going to be a lot shorter. We had a lot to cover in this initial video using TCP. Most of that's not going to change when we switch that underlying transport from TCP to Redis. So look for a shorter video next, and then gRPC, yeah, that's probably going to be another longer one. See you in the next video.